Welcome, everyone, to the Interventional Endoscopist. I'm your host, Dave. So, quick disclaimer before we jump in. This episode is really meant for education and discussion only. We're going to reference public information and general concepts. It's not really meant to be medical advice, and we're not making treatment recommendations for any individual patient. Harith, welcome to the Interventional Endoscopist, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Munkenwall. Such a pleasure to be here.
So, before we get started, let's talk a little bit about you and your journey. And I want to give you the floor to kind of introduce yourself to the audience, and then we can kind of go into some of the questions I had for you.
Sure. So my name is Harith Rajagopalan. I'm an MD PhD physician scientist and trained in cardiology. And I had a mother and father who have diabetes, an uncle who had diabetes. And so from an early time in my life, I've been quite aware of the fact that South Asians like ourselves are at pretty high risk of developing diabetes, and doing so when our weight is not particularly high, just something about us that puts us at high risk. And then I also saw how my father and my uncle try to manage their diabetes by taking medicines and exercising, but the disease kept progressing despite all of their efforts. And it wasn't until I went through all of medical school and then all of residency and then was in cardiology fellowship when I finally realized that when we manage and try to control blood sugar, what we are doing is dealing with the downstream symptom of a progressive disease, not the upstream root cause of that disease. And never would we ever think about treating any problem by just treating the downstream symptoms if you can fix the upstream root cause. But no one had an idea about what the actual upstream root cause of diabetes actually is. I mean, we know that the body is not making enough insulin in type 2 diabetes to deal with the body's insulin resistance. We know it's associated with weight gain and obesity, but we don't really know why people develop all of those things. And about 15 years ago, when I was a cardiology fellow, I came across a patient of mine who underwent a bariatric surgery. And this patient had an immediate improvement in their weight and in their blood sugar. And when I saw him post-op day 3 in the hospital, he also told me that he had no appetite for the foods that used to give him such pleasure. He was not interested in eating high-fat, high-sugar foods anymore. And nothing had changed, and yet his blood sugar had also completely normalized. And so the question that I became very intrigued with is bariatric surgery teaching us something about the gut's role as a potential root cause of obesity and type 2 diabetes? Is it accidentally curing the root cause, and we didn't even know that the root cause was in the gut? And that sort of question is what started me on a journey that led me to start the company a couple of years later, and then got us to where we are now.
Now, that's amazing. I mean, also being South Asian myself, diabetes, huge problem. I have an uncle who's, going to need a kidney transplant because of diabetic nephropathy, and it's a problem. And, I belong to a couple of Facebook groups, and there's a lot of young physicians on there. Well, young is relative, as we age, but,
Yeah.
and it's not uncommon to see once a month or twice a month a young Indian man who's in his 50s, who by all intents and purposes is healthy and maybe even a vegetarian, and they're having sudden cardiac events, and you find out that they were diabetic even though they were so thin and healthy. But it's something about our genetics that make us prone to cardiac disease as well as diabetes in both. So how about end your journey along the way? Any people that you can kind of remember as mentors or influences? And you mentioned the patient that kind of spawned your interest in this, but how about some of the influences and mentors you've had?
I mean, I've had amazing mentors along the way. I'm very grateful for. When I was an MD PhD student at Johns Hopkins, one of my PhD advisors was a very, very well-known physician scientist named Bert Vogelstein. And we were working on colorectal cancer at the time. But one of the things that Bert taught me was that whenever you do basic research, you should always be asking what relevance that research might have for how we might treat patients. And he's lived that very well throughout his entire career. But one nuance in the lesson that he taught me was actually quite interesting. He said, there will be many people who will tell you you do not understand enough yet about a particular problem. That's not the core question. The question is not whether you understand it enough or understand it completely. Question is whether you understand it enough to actually be able to do something to help patients. And so years later, when I came to this patient of mine who had undergone a bariatric surgery, though there were many questions about how bariatric surgery is working, that question came back to my mind. Hey, do we now understand enough about the role of the gut in how it's driving obesity and type 2 diabetes to be able to begin to do something about it in a whole new way? And so that mentor meant a lot to me because of the framing of how much do you need to learn from a basic science standpoint in order to try to make an impact clinically.
Awesome. So when we talk about, or when people talk about the technology, they've talked about durability of treatment. I think you may have even used these words in previous talks. So when you use the word durability, what do you think, what do people mean by that? Or what are you trying to impose upon, not impose, but impress upon people? So let's define it in human terms. When you say durable metabolic benefit from this procedure, what does that look like in a patient's life?
Well, I mean, would it be useful to just talk a little bit about what this technology is and then
Let's go back a little bit. That's great. We need to get into that. We didn't explain that very well. So let's go ahead and start talking about the DMR.
Yeah, okay. So our lead technology that we're developing is a new procedure and technique that we've been developing called duodenal mucosal resurfacing. And the reason that we're doing this is because we're targeting a region of the gut, which is the first section of the small intestine called the duodenum. And the duodenum plays a much bigger role in metabolic control than people would have thought 10 or 20 years ago. The reason that the duodenum is so important is because it is the first place in the body that food, like proteins and fats and sugars, actually get absorbed from your digestive tract into your bloodstream. That doesn't happen in the esophagus. It does not happen in the stomach. It happens as soon as the food leaves the stomach and then enters the duodenum. And the lining of the duodenum has cells that are designed to absorb fat, sugar, and protein, and also has other cells called enteroendocrine cells that are designed to try to detect what types of nutrients are coming and how much nutrients are coming so that it can send neural signals through the vagus nerve and hormonal signals into the bloodstream to help the body prepare for what food is about to come. And so the duodenum is like this hugely important organ. It is the first site of absorption, but it is also the early warning beacon for the brain and the rest of the body to know whether you are eating, how much you are eating. And you can imagine, like, most of our ancestors would spend a very little amount of time eating and a very long amount of time between meals. And yet you have to keep your blood sugar and your blood fat levels within a normal range, even if you're not eating for 15, 16, 18 hours. And then the second that you start to eat, your brain and your liver and the rest of your body needs to know that it's got to stop breaking down energy stores and begin to store away the energy that's being absorbed. It's kind of like your iPhone, plugging in your iPhone and the battery knowing that it's got to start charging as opposed to discharging, right? The duodenum is a place in your body where the body knows for the first time for sure that it's got to start charging itself. And the enteroendocrine cells in the duodenum are responsible for sending signals to the brain and the rest of the body to know that that's about to happen.
And these cells are located primarily within the mucosa, correct?
These cells are located within the mucosa, and just on the other side of the mucosa are capillaries and nerve endings that are receiving neurohormonal signals from the enteroendocrine cells and then transmitting it to the rest of the body. So that's why the duodenum is important. Right. The next thing is, why is the duodenum diseased, or we call it duodenal dysfunction, DD? Why is there duodenal dysfunction in people with obesity and type 2 diabetes? And then third, what can we do about it? And that's where Revita DMR comes in.
Right.
Okay. So what goes wrong in people who eat a high fat and high sugar diet is that those same cells in the duodenum that are supposed to absorb nutrients and then send signals get altered after chronic exposure to high fat, high sugar diets. The stem cells in the duodenal mucosa respond to the food that you eat over a long period of time. And now many researchers have shown that if you chronically expose the duodenum to, say, high fructose corn syrup and trans fats like Coca-Cola, McDonald's, that kind of food, then you get an increase in absorptive cells and a decrease in the number of enteroendocrine signaling cells. So what that causes is too much absorption of fat and sugar in the duodenum and too little signaling from the mucosa to the brain and to the liver to tell the body that its food is coming in. And all of that is why people with obesity and type 2 diabetes feel hungry all of the time and become insulin resistant. We think it's the very first thing that goes wrong in the body that drives obesity and type 2 diabetes. And that's a pretty exciting observation, because once you feel like, okay, now we know something that's going wrong in the body that's driving these disease processes, can you do something to change the disease process so that people can live a healthier life? Isn't that what everyone wants at the end of the day, is to be able to be healthier, right?
Exactly.
So what we prototyped many years ago, and we were the first ones to do this, was to ask, if you remove that unhealthy tissue in the duodenal mucosa, can you reverse the underlying pathology that's driving obesity and type 2 diabetes? So in an animal model of type 2 diabetes, we went in and we removed the lining of the duodenal mucosa, and then that mucosa grew back. And yet even then, the animals had lost weight and improved their blood sugar. We then prototyped human use devices, and then we can talk about our clinical trials that have basically validated everything that was seen in preclinical models. But the idea became, hey, you can use ablation in the duodenal mucosa to reverse the pathology that accrues from years and years of an unhealthy diet. And there are many huge corollary observations that come from that. Number one, you can't expect a diet alone to help you maintain lower body weight and lower blood sugar for the long haul, because a diet alone doesn't fix the pathology in the duodenum. So the second that you stop dieting, guess what happens? You're going to regain your weight. Your blood sugar is going to get worse again.
Yeah.
You can't expect GLP-1s to work forever either, because once you stop taking the GLP-1 and it's no longer in your system, there's no longer any durable effect.
Right.
But what's really interesting about duodenal mucosal resurfacing, and we'll focus on the animal models, is that even after the mucosa grows back, blood sugar and body weight remain better chronically. So what you're doing is you are resetting some fundamental thing that's wrong in the body towards a healthier state. And now, after years of development, we are generating pivotal trial evidence for Revita's ability to be able to prevent weight regain after GLP-1 discontinuation, precisely to ask whether you can durably restore a better metabolic set point with a single 45-minute outpatient endoscopic treatment.
So the R obviously standing for resurfacing, but essentially it's resetting as well. So you could call it duodenal mucosa resetting as well. But that makes a lot of sense. I like the idea. So when you were in the lab and you guys were looking at removing the surface or the mucosal surface in the pig, was always heat? Was it what other modalities did you look at? Why did you settle on the current thing? Maybe even talk a little bit about the current setup and how the device and the procedure works.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so we have an endoscopic device that we've developed. It's a catheter that's introduced into the mouth, past the stomach, and then into the duodenum. And it's a dual functioning catheter. The first one automatically injects saline into the submucosal space circumferentially. What that does is it puts essentially, saline into a spongy layer in the middle of the wall in order to separate the mucosa that you wish to ablate from the underlying tissue that you don't want to damage. And then our catheter recirculates hot water within the balloon at a temperature of about 90 degrees Celsius for about 10 seconds. And what that does is it delivers a precise amount of heat energy that allows the mucosa to be ablated without damaging deeper structures. There are potentially other ways of doing it, but the duodenum has a very irregular surface, as you know, and the duodenum also takes a very sharp set of bends and turns in the retroperitoneum around the pancreas and after the stomach. And so the approach that we started to develop really demonstrated a lot of promise from both a safety standpoint and from dose-dependent efficacy in our preclinical models. And that's what led us to feel like this would be a great approach going into the clinic.
So I have a question just about the saline, because most interventional endoscopists, which is a lot of who would be listening to this podcast, they obviously use saline cushions or saline pillows, as we described, and to remove polyps of all kind. When you mentioned on the device that you're able to inject circumferentially, how is that with one needle, or how does that inject? I'm just because I've never actually seen the device in other than LinkedIn posts and things, but I've never seen it in real life. Curious about that.
Yeah, so there are 3 catheter ports, 120 degrees apart from one another, circumferentially around a balloon. Each of the catheter ports has a vacuum port within it that sucks in the mucosa just enough so that the mucosa is held very precisely in each port. And then the physician advances a needle, a cartridge on the handle that it puts needles directly into the submucosa in each of those 3 locations simultaneously. We have a touchscreen interface on our console. Press a button on that touchscreen interface. Saline is automatically injected circumferentially. I think that the thing I would tell an interventional endoscopist is that it's an automated manner of very reliably delivering saline circumferentially without the artistry that is normally expected with, say, a Carlock needle, where you got to put it in the right place. This is just an automated, directed manner of doing so. And it gives you a lot of confidence in your ability to then perform an ablation in the duodenal mucosa, which is, as you know, like a very sensitive organ that you don't want to damage, next to the pancreas, next to the liver. And that saline cushion provides a lot of reassurance on the safety of the ablation.
So no, that's a great. I mean, I that makes a lot of sense. Actually, that's really wonderful. But how long is the section that's injected?
Yeah. So in our first in human trial, we didn't really know how long of the duodenum do you want to ablate? Where exactly do you want to ablate? It was pretty clear from the preclinical evidence that the section of the duodenum right after the ampulla of Vater is the area that is particularly diseased in people after a high-fat, high-sugar diet. And so we began focusing on how much of the post-ampulla duodenum do you need to ablate. We did a single ablation in some patients, and then we did 2 ablations and then 3 ablations. And when we looked at the patients, we saw that if you ablate roughly 10 centimeters of the duodenum, you get a much better effect than if you ablate less than 4 centimeters of the duodenum.
Okay.
Over time, we've improved our technique, and now we are ablating on average about 14 to 16 centimeters of the duodenum, basically from the ampulla, just past the ampulla, to the ligament of Treitz. And that roughly approximates 14 to 16 centimeters in most people. And we have seen dose-dependent effects in our preclinical work. And that's what gives us confidence that we will also be able to show sham-controlled evidence of efficacy when you compare to a sham procedure, which is what's required for the pivotal trial.
And what is the most common misconception here? So you've done a wonderful job explaining this procedure to me. Now I can actually visualize this heat in my head. But when you describe, interventional endoscopists like myself, or someone who will be doing this procedure eventually, what kind of misconceptions that you run into, or what are some of the wrong beliefs that you have to kind of correct for those physicians?
I think that once we have a chance to explain to people what we're doing and why, I think most people like you basically say, okay, I get it. Like that makes sense. But I think those people who are not as well versed in it would probably say, that sounds complicated,
Yeah.
you know? So the major thing to sort of correct is like, actually, it's not so complicated. And one of the things that I might share with you is that while we are now doing it in a manner that requires fluoroscopy and a guide wire, um, we're actually quite far along in a through the scope system that would not require fluoroscopy and a guide wire as well. And so assuming that we're able to successfully complete this pivotal trial and then be able to work through regulatory clearance in the United States, you could reasonably expect that what I'm describing to you could be delivered in a manner that can be through the scope so that it will be much more straightforward even than what we're describing now.
Yeah, I think for the quote unquote average gastroenterologist, and is that through the scope is what makes a lot of sense for them.
Yeah.
The international world is getting more familiar and more comfortable with over the scope devices. Like we have both scope clips, we have sheets that fit onto your scope as you do things. None of us really love them, but we're very comfortable with them. So I think going through the scope is always going to be a wonderful thing. Let me ask you another question that so I need to be corrected if I'm wrong here. So when this process Fractal first came on to the stage many, I don't know, maybe about 5, 7 years ago, if I remember correctly, or first time I heard about it.
Mhm.
I had the impression that at that time that was more geared towards a weight loss device. And has it always been that way, or was it all from the beginning? Was it a type diabetes treatment method with the benefit of some weight loss? Is that or has that changed at all?
So when we started, we were focused exclusively on type 2 diabetes.
Okay.
Okay. And then what we observed is that as we were ablating longer segments of the duodenum, we were beginning to see effects on body weight in people with type 2 diabetes that you were not seeing with shorter segments of ablation of the duodenum. So the effects on diabetes seem to be occurring with shorter lengths of ablation versus the effects on obesity. Okay. And about 2 years ago, we were approached by major players in the obesity space, drug manufacturers,
Okay.
who told us that they've got these wonderful medicines for weight loss, think semaglutide and tirzepatide,
Right.
and yet the patient with obesity does not want to be on these medicines to manage their weight for the rest of their lives. They want to be able to use the medicine for a period of time in order to be able to achieve a certain amount of weight loss. And then they want to be able to use that as a reset to then live a healthier life without needing ongoing medical therapy. And why is that relevant? Because if you think about the mechanism of Revita, if in fact it is reducing the body's metabolic set point, if it is resetting that set point, then why not imagine that it could prove to be a useful way to help maintain body weight loss for the people who are looking for or needing an off ramp from GLP-1s? So we went to talk to clinicians about this, and what we heard is like, this is a huge unmet need. We talked to patients, and they said, this is my single biggest need in obesity now is how do I maintain my body weight loss?
Right.
We talked to payers, and they said, we need to be able to have a solution to allows us to not have to pay for GLP-1s for the rest of a person's life.
Yeah.
And then we talked to the regulators, and the regulators said, we are more, some version of, we are more concerned about the ability to maintain body weight loss than we are about achieving the weight loss in the first place. And
Mhm.
so we got breakthrough device designation from the FDA, which many weight loss therapies have not gotten, because the better the drugs get at helping you lose weight, the more dangerous it will be for people when they stop taking those medicines eventually and then rebound violently back to their pre-drug weight. So for all of those reasons, we began a clinical study, and that showed a lot of promise in an open label. And then we did a randomized sham controlled pilot study that's showing incredible promise as well. And now this month, we will complete randomizing our pivotal study. So our plan is to be able to share top line pivotal data later this year and potentially even file for approval with the FDA all before the end of this year.
It's
And
very
so
Yeah.
And so, like, it's sort of a couple things I would say, like, the data around the role of the duodenum and duodenal mucosal resurfacing seems to be real, and that data evidence is growing. We'll have pivotal data this year. We are incredibly excited about the market opportunity for patients and for physicians in post GLP-1 weight maintenance. We think that is an area that a GI endoscopist can own because because I think a GI endoscopist would feel very comfortable recommending a procedure targeting the root cause of obesity for somebody who's looking for an off-ramp, because the endoscopy skill set is uniquely suited to solving that problem for them. And I think that though we paused our type 2 diabetes clinical study, we fully will come back to it. And so we see the potential for two indications from this one procedure, an indication in post GLP-1 weight maintenance and an indication in type 2 diabetes.
So
And once we go ahead.
go ahead. No, you go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, no, no. So then I would say basically that if all goes well, we're talking about potentially filing for approval this year. That takes a few quarters. And so this is something that could be a real option for interventional endoscopists in the relatively near term.
Yeah. So let me ask you on that along those lines.
Yeah.
So we have these studies that you are going to talk about. Hopefully, just in a few minutes, whatever you're allowed to talk about.
Yeah.
When you brought the concept and obviously your passion, your concept about this procedure to different endoscopists, and it sounds like the reaction mostly is very, very positive. Makes sense to us. It makes sense to me. But how do you decide to get when you start these trials, which clinicians you're going to work with? What are the inroads you create? You're coming from a cardiology world, so how do you decide as a company run by you, like, hey, this is a good place to focus? And how did you get involved with all these different sites that you're are working with and you will be working with?
Well, I mean, I think we're very fortunate to have an incredible set of clinical partners. And there are a lot of people in the GI clinical community who've developed a lot of experience in running clinical studies in obesity and type 2 diabetes over the years. And this is an area where experience really counts and it really matters. And so the things that we look for are people who are passionate about the therapeutic area that we're targeting, people who really want to devote the time and energy to this, people who have the infrastructure to be able to do complicated clinical trials, because that's a skill set in and of itself that's different from clinical practice, right? People who are practicing in institutions or within an infrastructure where a clinical trial can get started in a reasonable length of time. And the most important thing ultimately is not even whether the physician wants to do it or whether the infrastructure exists, but the most important thing is to feel confident that you're going to be able to generate high quality data in order to be able to present it to regulators, to payers, to other clinicians, because this is a controlled clinical experiment at the end of the day. And so the choices that you might make and whom you work with, if it's approved, are not exactly the same choices or decision criteria as who you would work with when it's in a clinical trial.
100%. And just for any of the listeners out there, because we do have a few early career interventionalists that listen to this podcast, if any of them are in that right setup, how can they get onto your radar or your company's radar to participate in a future trial or something along those lines? What's a good way for any of them to reach out?
Well, my email address is harith@fractyl.com, HARITH@FRACTYL.com. And you can please feel free to reach out to me directly. I mean, one of the best parts about what I do as a physician myself is building relationships with physicians who have similar interests and who are similarly passionate about figuring out cool new ways to solve really big disease categories like what we're focused on here. So anyone who wants to share that passion with me, I'm always eager to build relationships with.
So let me ask another question that, you're in a space where, weight loss and diabetes control, we've mentioned GLP-1s quite a bit. It's
Yeah.
a very hot topic in the world of medicine right now. And so it plays that there's a lot of potential hype that can happen. Sometimes good hype and oftentimes bad stuff. So where is like a dangerous point for you as a company? Like, hey, slow your roll. This isn't really what we're here for. I mean, what's the kind of point that you realize that maybe people are running with this in the wrong direction, or thinking about it the wrong way? What's something that you've come across?
Well, I think that um, we are all tempted. There's sort of two categories of people. There are people who are inductive thinkers and there are people who are deductive thinkers, and each of them can get you into trouble in different ways, right? The deductive thinkers are ones who will only believe what they've already seen with their own eyes, right? And these people can be slow to appreciate some of the lessons that are circumstantial that we're picking up from, like, the basic science around bariatric surgery and how it works, to the basic science around the role of the duodenum and how it plays a role in disease, to then what you might do with it in order to be able to have a favorable impact for patients. And so that deductive reasoning, like I only believe it after I've seen it with my own eyes, can make it hard to bring change in this world. But then the inductive reasoners, the ones who are willing to take leaps of logic and leaps of faith, would say, well, if it works like this, then I believe this, and then it should also do this, are maybe too quick to assume that they know all of the things, that they already know all of the things that you need to learn from experience and from clinical studies, and then leap to conclusions too prematurely. So both sides can actually be problematic. So the key is to be like sufficiently optimistic and, you know, inductive to believe this is an interesting area that we got to explore very carefully and learn, but then sufficiently deductive to say, I'm sure I'm going to learn lessons along the way that are going to frame or inform or shape my understanding of how to solve this problem. Like, you got to ride that sweet spot between both sides.
Yeah. So let's with that, let's turn into the kind of data. Why don't I give you a few moments to talk about where you are from a data perspective and maybe a little bit of description. I mean, you mentioned the sham controlled studies, which I think are very important for credibility. It's
Yep.
really, it to show that it works against something that the patient thought they got is amazing. Obviously very difficult to control for in a way that's ethical, feasible, and scientifically clean, but you guys have done it. So let's talk a little bit about all the things that you've come across so far.
Perfect. So once we decided about 2 years ago that post GLP-1 weight maintenance was a very exciting opportunity for us to play and to lead, we began 3 separate patient cohorts in the US. One is the Reveal 1 cohort, which are patients who are already on a GLP-1. They've already lost a bunch of weight. Their weight is now plateaued and they need or want an off-ramp. That's an open label cohort. And we presented in December data from about 20 patients who are 6 months after stopping GLP-1, where they had lost about a quarter of their body weight on the GLP-1. I mean, just think about that.
Yeah.
They were on a GLP-1 for over a year on average. They had lost over almost a quarter of their body weight. And at 6 months, they had only regained 1.5%. Basically nothing, 3 pounds. Okay. And that was open label data, but it was very, very exciting, very encouraging. And even after stopping their GLP-1, you would expect their blood sugar to worsen, even though it's in a patient population that's obese and non-diabetic, but their blood sugar did not worsen in that open label cohort. But it is not easy to go from a open label study to a big pivotal randomized sham control study, because there's fundamentally a whole bunch of new things that crop up operationally in a study where there's a sham control. So we had a remain midpoint cohort, 45 patients, prospective, randomized, double-blinded, sham controlled, 2-to-1 randomization of Revita to sham, where we have now shared 3-month data and 6-month data. And what we are seeing in the weight maintenance is the primary endpoint. So what we are looking for is so in this study, we took patients who are not on a GLP-1. We gave them all tirzepatide, which is the active agent in Mounjaro and Zepbound.
Hmm.
I traded it to that they got to at least 15% total body weight loss. And then once they achieved 15% total body weight loss, we stopped their medicine, did their baseline weight, and then a week later, they had an endoscopic procedure, during which time they were randomized to Revita or sham,
Mm.
2-to-1.
You're right.
And then we followed them off GLP-1 at 3 months and at 6 months.
Okay.
And the results are very encouraging in this pilot sham control study, because the patients who have undergone Revita at 6 months are regaining considerably less weight than the patients who underwent the sham procedure. Patients who lose more body weight, the sham arm is regaining weight very, very rapidly.
Mm.
And the Revita arm is demonstrating a very nice signal that seems to be growing over time, which suggests that it's looking better at 6 months than it did at 3 months. And that gives you a strong argument for this being a durable, potentially durable effect from Revita, because the mucosa that we have ablated has healed by month 1. The tirzepatide they were taking is out of their system by month 1. And yet at month 6, we're continuing to see persistent activity. That's very, very encouraging proof of concept.
Yeah, very positive. Yeah, for sure.
There's a couple other interesting things which tie to the mechanism, which we also observed. Good cholesterol is HDL,
Right.
and good cholesterol is improved dramatically in people who undergo Revita versus the sham. And the triglyceride to HDL ratio is improved very dramatically as well. This is consistent with what we had seen in prior clinical studies in type 2 diabetes. It's nice to also see it in a sham-controlled setting with in the obesity setting. Because at the end of the day, what we worry about is liver health and cardiovascular health for these people. And if the triglycerides and HDL are getting better, what that suggests is that liver lipogenesis is getting better, the things that put you at risk of MAFLD, and cardiovascular risk is getting better as well, all speaking to the metabolic benefit of duodenal intervention.
Yeah, and as a former hepatologist, I see this kind of falling into that MAFLD and MASLD spectrum of treatment at some point as well. If assuming that the approvals come out and everything like that.
Right. And so that would be a potential further area for exploration, because in a prior type 2 diabetes patient population study, we had run a sham-controlled trial where we compared Revita to sham in type 2 diabetes. And those individuals who had MAFLD on the liver MRI had a statistically significant reduction in liver fat compared to sham with Revita. So I think that all of this is highly, highly consistent across all the studies that we've run.
Yeah. I mean, I guess in a future study, I don't know that you're already doing this or not, but I mean, potentially even getting a fiber scan before and after treatment would be good information to have in that regard as well. So
Super interesting, yeah. And then the last thing I'll say about what we're seeing is, when we had been doing this in open label work, patients were telling us, telling their doctors, Doc, I feel like a switch has flipped because it's easier for me to avoid high fat, high sugar foods
wow.
than it was before. So here we did a patient reported outcome survey, a validated survey looking at food craving.
Right.
And what we observed is that patients are craving sugary foods much less than the sham, which says that's a pretty interesting thing, right? Because if the constellation turns out that you can prevent weight regain in people who are stopping the GLP-1, you can improve cardiometabolic lipid profile and MASLD, and tell patients, you may crave sugary foods less.
Yeah. Which
without losing the satisfaction that sometimes GLP-1 causes. We're not hearing that they're losing their love of life or food. What we're just hearing is they're not craving sugar as much, which is nice. Who among us wouldn't want that?
No, and it's full circle to your observation when you were a fellow to the patient who had the bariatric surgery, saying that I don't want to eat the crap or junk that I was eating before. So I mean, that's it is a really full circle moment for you there.
Totally. It's going, and you know what the nice thing is, it's all internally consistent, right?
Right.
The things that we're seeing is not any different than what duodenal bypass had shown surgically. There's not a single thing that I'm telling you that has not already been demonstrated in that way. So now we're just showing another way of getting there, which is now non-surgical and endoscopic, and um, heading towards a through the scope scalable technique that you could imagine being available for any gastroenterology practice to be able to offer for patients.
Yeah, and I think the long-term goal, which I'm just making an assumption here, but I'm fairly certain I know the answer to this question, but the long-term goal would be for this to be in an ASC type of environment where it's an outpatient procedure. I mean, you just go in, 30-minute endoscopy, and you're out the door and you're on your way. Obviously, with fluoro, that's not the case today, but like you said, you're inventing or you're working on it through the scope device that would make it a lot more palatable to be able to be done at a quick center, at least an HOPD, if not an ESC. So,
Well, we
uh,
view this as HOPD out of the gate,
mm,
candidly, but I do think that the through the scope, based on the work that we've done so far,
yeah,
there's no reason it could not be ASC under 30 minutes. That's what we're targeting without fluoro,
right.
not requiring any special scope or anything. That's the goal, is to be able to make this available to the broad population of patients who are struggling with metabolic disease and offer potentially the first scalable disease modifying therapy for those two indications.
For sure. For sure. I mean, yeah, it's a huge patient population, not just in the US, but globally. So, with this though, as I'm hearing you talk about the procedure, earlier, I'm thinking like this guy, he did a cardiology fellowship and he's essentially done a endoscopy fellowship just by learning how these devices work and everything like that. But safety. Let's kind of turn our attention to safety.
Yeah.
Um, Adverse effects, complications like perforations, things like that, because those are probably the biggest questions you'll get from endoscopists, about how safe is it, what can go wrong, and how do I prevent that from happening?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, I think one of the things that we think is pretty compelling are the AEs and tolerability profile that we have been sharing from our US clinical work so far, from the Reveal open label data and then from the Remain randomized data. We have seen no device or procedure related serious adverse events. Most patients do not experience any symptoms at all. Those who do, roughly 20 to 25% on average, experience mild symptoms, transient, meaning a couple of days post-procedure, and self-limited. Um, One of our CEC members said that the AE profile is virtually indistinguishable from a routine upper endoscopy wherein you might, that you might do. So what we think is quite important for the overall scalability of the technique is a safety profile that fits within the envelope of the procedures that you do on the most routine basis in GI endoscopy. And that's partly why we have emphasized so heavily the value of submucosal injection in order to be able to ensure safety, is partially why we feel like it's super important to do a proper physician certification and training program,
Right.
and why we are going to be as careful as we possibly can in order to make this available broadly, but carefully.
Yeah.
And how a through the scope catheter will obviously help in that regard as well. So we've been focused on making sure that we take away the things that could go wrong in broad utilization and making sure that we stay ahead to keep the safety profile that we're so proud of.
No, and and I'll just jump in with a comment about that because I think a lot of people who may be listening, fellows, whatnot, say, you go through all this training, or why do I need to do additional training to do a specific procedure? Well, when companies start out, it's not uncommon actually. And many companies come out with a new technique or a new device. They will require endoscopists to be certified. You may have to go to a 1-day pig lab course somewhere and learn. But when Orbera came out with their weight loss balloon, or when Ovesco came out with their full thickness resection device, even the most seasoned endoscopist would have to go to their course, whether that be in Chicago or wherever it was, and spend a day and learn how to use the device. Because when it's a new technology or a new a new way of doing things or a new way of looking at things. The thing that will kill innovation is irresponsible use and not being well trained on how to use the device. And so I think it's extremely responsible and important for you to require that of the physicians who are going to do this procedure.
I appreciate it. One of the things we sort of inculcate internally is to say, pretend every patient is your mom or dad.
Yep.
That's it.
Yep.
Okay. Pretend every patient is your mom or dad. What would you want the physician and the team and the company to have done if that were your mom or dad?
100%. And like I experienced that quite a bit. There's a procedure, you're probably familiar with the Poland procedure. Very, very popular. It's this thing that it's the sexy girl on the block around that everybody wants to learn how to do that procedure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've been asked many times, like, why would you do a poem? I said, listen, I live in a city where I have two people who do more than 200 a year. If my mom or dad needed a poem, I'm not going to send it to myself who might do 10 a year or 15 a year and not do it well. I'm going to send it to the guys who do 200. So you really need to make sure that, number one, that if that's your focus, if your patient is equivalent in your mind to your loved ones, then you'll never go wrong. If you treat every patient that way, like, hey, I'm doing the right thing because if this is my relative or my loved one, this is how I'd approach it. And you won't go wrong with those situations. I mean, yeah, you'll still have complications from time to time, but you won't do the wrong thing. So with
I
the
agree with you about the analogy to poem in one way, and then I'm going to challenge you in another way.
yeah,
I totally agree with everything you said about it, about you should go to the most common people.
right.
But poem is largely for achalasia, and like the number of people with achalasia out there is relatively small, right?
It's fine.
Whereas the number of people out there with obesity who are going to be on a GLP-1 in the next 5 years is going to be 30 to 40 million people.
100%.
Okay. So we're talking about colonoscopy scale, not
Yeah.
achalasia scale. And so as we think about how we develop this, we're thinking about like, okay, you're going to need to make sure that there are enough people out there who can feel completely comfortable doing this, because this is something that's affecting millions of people a year. And so therefore that's kind of how we're thinking about how this scales.
No, it makes a lot of sense. And I think as you mature as a company and as your approvals come in, if you haven't already thought of it early, I would encourage the company to start looking at getting involved with general GI fellowships, getting those fellowed second and third year, because my experience has been when a device manufacturer doesn't really show other accessories or devices to fellows, when they go out into the real world, so to speak, they don't ask for those devices. They ask for the ones that they see, and they ask for what's there.
Yeah.
I think my experience is the companies that have always kind of come out and said, these are our devices, these are our procedures. And, they throw a bone to the fellow and say, hey, come on out. We're going to bring a device out here. We'll let you do it on a pig lab and just learn it, and then they're more apt to adopt that in the real world when they're out working than if they don't get exposure to it. So I think that's just something I would encourage you guys to do.
Totally.
Also, so where do you see, I mean, as with any new procedure and technology, it comes out, it's safe. Best case scenario, you have your FDA approval by the end of the year. The next step is going to be the big challenge is the payers. Obviously, you alluded to that earlier, that they're eager to see this because they don't want to be paying for GLP-1s forever. How do you see the reimbursement side of this working out, and what is Fractyl as a company doing right now to plan for that in the future?
I mean, I think that reimbursement is the key unlock here, because if you look at the study and how rapidly it enrolled, we were humbled by how rapidly the word spread just by word of mouth without any marketing for this trial to fully enroll. It was amazing to watch. Like in Silicon Valley, sometimes you can hear venture capitalists talking about this concept called product market fit. And the way they define a startup finding product market fit is when the market is literally pulling your product out of your hands faster than you can make it or ship it. And that's literally what happened with this Remain study in weight maintenance. We would open up a site and we would send them some lab kits and get them going. And then we would hear from them, okay, we have 25 patients coming in next week. 25 patients coming in. Like the rate of interest in the GLP-1 off-ramp exceeds anything I've ever seen. Okay. So the key unlock is going to be reimbursement.
Right.
And we have some tailwinds in that regard. One tailwind is that the FDA has granted breakthrough device designation for Revita in post-GLP-1 weight maintenance. And so there are mechanisms within Medicare to enable early reimbursement and payment for breakthrough devices.
Right.
Number two, Medicare has just agreed to pay for GLP-1 drugs. And so they're sort of coming along with the idea that like we're going to be covering these medicines, but the chronic,
So what next?
we better figure out a way to make sure that people maintain that body weight loss, that they're not going to be on these medicines, because otherwise we're just lighting dollars on fire, right?
Yeah.
Why should a payer pay for a person to be on a GLP-1 for 6 to 9 months if they stop it and then they lose all the metabolic benefit from it? So what we have heard from payers is that if they're covering GLP-1s, it's supernatural for them to want to also cover the GLP-1 off-ramp, because otherwise they feel like, well, what are we paying for this for anyway? And that's where some of the secondary benefits around cardiovascular, liver benefits, et cetera, will be very helpful in order to build an argument around the health economic value. But the initial value is simply the potential cost offset from the medicine alone, which the payer can see on day one.
That's amazing. That's amazing. No, I mean, it makes a lot of sense, because I do believe that, yeah, you like you said, they're lighting dollars on fire. You have this medicine that's super expensive, doesn't look like it's going to get cheaper anytime soon. And if you can keep people off of it, that's a win. You know, maybe the pharma doesn't want to hear it, but maybe that inspires them to work with you guys. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
So in getting ready for the podcast, I was looking at your website, and there's a concept on there. And if you don't want to talk about it, we don't have to. But I'm just curious about the Rejuva. Could you talk a bit about what that is for people who might not have heard the term?
Sure. So Rejuva is we call it a smart GLP-1 platform. And so the idea is, how might you, given all the conversation we've just been having about how GLP-1s are really good for you, but most people will not stay on them for the rest of your life, is there a way to develop a best-in-class GLP-1? What would that need to look like? I think it would need to be the most potent, the most durable, the best tolerated, and the most convenient GLP-1 out there on the market. I think we have something that has the potential for those things based on our preclinical data. I know that's a bold statement, but we've compared it head-to-head against semaglutide in preclinical models, and it appears to be more potent than semaglutide on lowering body weight and blood sugar, more durable in animals that get a one-time administration of the Rejuva gene therapy compared to chronic administration of semaglutide in a diabetes model. We are seeing a one-time administration have very long-lasting effects compared to chronic drug therapy. So from a convenience standpoint, we think it could be better. And when we measure the amount of GLP-1 in the bloodstream, it is 1/10 to 1/20th that required by semaglutide for its effects. And because circulating levels of semaglutide are what is thought to be associated with the nausea and vomiting that it causes, our GI, our experts believe, scientific advisors, that we are much less likely to have the tolerability issues associated. So Rejuva Smart GLP-1 may be a best-in-class GLP-1. How do we do it? We are locally administering via endoscopic ultrasound a tiny amount of AAV gene therapy directly into the pancreatic parenchyma with a proprietary 27-gauge, highly echogenic needle catheter that we've developed that goes through the greater curvature of the stomach. But yeah, so should we unpack that? 27-gauge, conical tip with a side port, so not coring.
Right.
The tip of it is 10 pancreatic acinar cells in width. The tip is extremely small. side port through the greater curvature of the stomach into the pancreatic parenchyma,
Okay.
1 cc into the body and 1 cc into the tail,
Okay.
with an automated delivery system where the endoscopist presses a button on the handle and then it has pressure regulated and flow regulated delivery directly into the pancreatic parenchyma. You can see the 27 gauge needle under EUS because of a proprietary echogenic coating that we put on the needle.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually easier to see than most 25 gauge needles on the market.
Yeah. Needles can be hard to see depending on the angle and stuff. So for sure.
This one's highly echogenic and quite easy to see in preclinical models. And then what we are administering is a gene therapy that provides the genetic code for the pancreatic beta cells that make insulin to also make nutrient-stimulated GLP-1.
Wow. Okay.
So it's still the one and done GLP-1 at
So
the end of the day.
question just out of ignorance, why would you require a 27 gauge needle? Because, for example, you could probably, I know that there is a theoretical risk, or there is a risk of more pancreatitis with a 19 gauge needle when you inject in the pancreas.
Yeah.
That is shown. The larger diameter needles are more likely to cause pancreatitis. But we have a 25 gauge needle that exists on the market. Several manufacturers make them. Why not just use that? Why create a 27? And just from a pure viewpoint, vantage point of being ignorant about this. So.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the needles that exist on the market that are any gauge, 19, 22, 25, they all are generally coring needles. And what happens is if you inject the gene therapy into the pancreas that way, it comes out through the needle track.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It doesn't actually stay there.
Okay.
So what we have developed is a needle catheter that keeps it locally within the pancreas and it diffuses locally into the islets and it doesn't come back out the needle track.
Okay. Makes sense. All right, cool. So do you see that's becoming, if this takes off as well, what's the ideal? Is you do the Rejuva and after a certain amount of time, or maybe at the same time, you do the Revita, and is that kind of the thought process, or is it one or the other, or are they supposed to be?
Remember we started with the Roux-en-Y gastric bypass surgery patient, right? What is happening in a Roux-en-Y? You are bypassing the duodenum and you are delivering nutrients to the distal gut, which is amplifying the post-meal GLP-1 signal. So one way of thinking about what we're doing is with Revita, we're doing the duodenal mechanism. And with Rejuva, we are targeting the hindgut mechanism of a Roux-en-Y. So if you put it together, you essentially deconstructed and reconstructed a Roux-en-Y in a 40-minute outpatient endoscopic procedure.
Yeah, and that's going to speak a lot to interventionalists because the worst thing most of us hate doing is an ERCP and somebody who's had a Roux-en-Y because they lost all this weight and they got gallstones.
Right, exactly. So this maintains the anatomy. It amplifies GLP-1 where the body needs it the most, which is within the islet. And our preclinical data suggests that it might be able to offer remission from type 2 diabetes.
That's amazing. No, this is really exciting stuff. I mean, I feel like I wish I was about 20 years younger because all the stuff that's going to be happening over the next 10 years is just fascinating. This is really great. Harith, I do want to thank you for spending so much time with me. But before we end the podcast, I usually do a little bit of a lightning round, just short answers to questions. So I'm just going to ask you quick questions and you just give me the first thing that comes to mind about it. So
Sure. Yeah.
What's the most misunderstood thing about metabolic endoscopy?
The most misunderstood thing about metabolic endoscopy is that patients would rather take pills than have their disease fixed endoscopically. I think in the general community, I think most people don't appreciate how desperate patients are to have the problem be solved for them rather than being resigned to taking pills for the rest of their lives.
Okay.
And I think GI doctors and we have a job to do to educate the public on the accessibility of techniques that you guys can offer that could offer people an alternative to chronic pharmacology.
All right. And speaking as an interventional endoscopist, we love to do procedures. So you're just giving us something more than two.
Totally. Exactly. Exactly. Well, you love to do procedures. Patients love to not have to have disease anymore.
100%.
There is a beautiful marriage there that just needs to be strengthened, you know?
Just need to say our vows.
Exactly. Exactly.
We didn't get a whole lot into the foundation of Fractal, but what's one lesson you learned the hard way when you were building Fractal as a company?
Change is hard. Paradigm shifts take time and take a huge amount of evidence. And I think that I underappreciated that out the gate.
And what would you tell your day one founder self today? If you had the DeLorean with the flex capacitor, what would you go back and say, hey, Harith, get ready for this?
I would tell myself, get ready. It's a long road and a challenging road. But if you could tell yourself, but if you could see that in 2026, you would be completing randomizations in a pivotal study and about to be able to deliver potentially practice-changing evidence this year, it's worth the journey.
And what's one belief you had earlier when you started the company that you changed your mind about today over the last several years?
Well, yeah, my belief was that ultimately the best science wins. And I think that it's actually much more complicated than that. I think it is that the science has to be married with the right market opportunity, and each stakeholder has to see 10x benefit for products to actually make it to the market.
Okay. And my very last question, what's the single biggest thing you want clinicians who remain, or what do you want clinicians to remain skeptical about in a healthy way as this field, as this discipline grows?
Okay, remain skeptical about.
Like what's a healthy, if you're coming to me, I'm starting to do these
Yeah.
procedures. What are you going to caution me about before I, run with it or go crazy?
Okay, yeah, I mean, I think I would say standardization and optimization of outcomes and results isn't done when you deliver a pivotal data and then launch. That's actually just day one of making it an amazing technology for patients. And so we think about this again with the idea that each of the patients that we treat is like our mother or our father, right? We want to do best for them. Then the work really begins post-launch in order to make sure that we're selecting the right patients, learning how to do the best procedure, and continuing to improve outcomes in the real world.
That's great. Thank you for doing that. So before we end, a couple of public service announcements I say at the end of every podcast. Number one is if you're a young interventional endoscopist or gastroenterologist, or even if you're an old one, you don't participate with your societies, procedures like the Revita and even the Rejuva platform won't take off unless the societies help them to get reimbursement, to help get them in front of physicians. So support your societies, participate in any way you can so that we can get access to life-changing technologies like this. And also, if you are struggling with any mental health issues, please seek the help that you need so that you're still here with us in the future. So medicine is a tough world, and it's really important to seek help when needed. Harith, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate you spending time out of your day with me. This has been fantastic. I've learned a lot just by talking to you. And I'm already in my mind thinking about how do I get involved with some of these procedures down the road. So I really appreciate it. And thank you so much for your time. You've been more than generous.
Thank you. I really appreciate it as well.
Right. And for that, everyone, that's it for the Interventional Endoscopist. Please, if you like this episode, drop a like, a subscription. It really helps and really appreciate it. So thank you.
Please hit that like button and that subscribe button.